Hey everybody! So today we're going to talk a little bit about alcohol markers and how to use them and some very specific techniques. We're also going to be looking at how they interact on some different paper types today. We will go through how to actually draw with them a little bit more effectively in another video. This one's just to kind of get you a little bit more of an idea what alcohol markers are like. So first off, there are lots of brands of alcohol marker. Over here we have two in particular today. We have the Ohuhu brand. Ohuhu is a very cheap, well, I say very cheap for alcohol markers brand. They're very cost effective and there's a lot of different colors. As you can see, we've got a big old box in here and I'm sure that's not as many as they have. So if you are just getting into alcohol markers, this is a good place to start and kind of get an idea on if you like the medium or not. On the other hand, we also have Copic markers. This happens to be my personal set of Copic markers. I also have a massive bag of more, but that's beside the point. I just like a lot of them. I really like this particular brand for a couple of different reasons. Unlike Ohuhu's, you actually have marker refills, so you can actually refill the ink. And even though, you know, do what's best for you and your budget, if you really like alcohol markers, my suggestion is to go with the Copics or some by Winsor and Newton, which I do not have. Because those two particular brands, I know for a fact, are very, very well done. And in the case of Copics, at least, you can refill as necessary. And you can see it's sometimes necessary. And you don't have to buy a new set every single time. These also come individually sold. I think the Winsor and Newton ones do as well. Ohuhu's, I believe you can only buy in sets. I don't think you can buy the individual markers, or there's only very few that you can buy individually. So that gives your options on getting replacements a little bit limited here. But then again, whatever works, whatever works. So alcohol markers, they are exactly as they sound. They are a marker that the pigment inside is carried by an alcohol, like rubbing alcohol base. That means that these in particular dry very quickly. They are usually buildable, like you can layer the color on top of itself in order to get darker versions of the same color up until a certain point. You can't just make it darker than it already is. And you can get very watercolor-like effects from these particular markers. So they're very useful in art purposes. You also obviously have a huge range of colors. So first thing you want to do after knowing your marker brand that you're going to be working with, whatever it's going to be, try to work within one brand. Not all brands play nicely together. Sometimes they get weird halo effects. So for most of my demo today, I'm going to be using my own markers that I'm a little bit more familiar with. I just do want you to know that these exist. So the first things that you want to do after you get your markers is you want to swatch them. So what do I mean by a swatch? So there's a couple different kinds of swatches that you're going to find. You're going to find swatches like this. These ones come with the Ohuhu sets. And what you're going to see is that next to each of these little labels, there is a little place where they have colored the marker in question. And this gives you a very realistic idea of what this color is supposed to look like, because sometimes the pink on your marker end does not always look the same as the pink that it colors. In fact, most of my pinks right here will usually look pretty dark. So this pink and this one on the board don't exactly match in eye to eye. They might seem a little bit more similar on y'all's screen. I do not know. But they can be very different from what's on the tub. So it is something to behoove you. So they have plain swatches like this, and sometimes you can find different types of swatches. This one right here is a hex chart that was made by a particular woman who wanted to label the colors as to what blended or what was close together in color. So you can see that most of the colors, as it goes through, it's what is looking similar to each other visually rather than what is numbered here on our bin. Because sometimes the numbering schemes are very different. What is usually true about any marker is that you will get a general idea of what color it is based on whatever code they have on the end. So for example, something that is pretty general no matter what is that you're going to have a colorless blender that is labeled 0 in some way. So this one is the Ohuhu, this one is the Copic, and these ones don't have any pigment in them. They're just plain alcohol or marker base with no color, and that is meant for blending purposes. Or you might have, for example, this one right here. Oh, that's an N. I have a, yeah. This right here. These ones are coded to be a cool gray. That's what that CG stands for, or in this case, just a C. They usually code in some way along the edge, so you know which marker in particular you're using. It is a very good idea anytime you're starting a marker project to have your swatches and your colors kind of pre-picked out, because a lot of the techniques that you use for these markers need to be done very fast. As I said, the alcohol dries quickly. So if you don't have an idea of what markers you're using or an idea of which markers you were using the previous day, sometimes you'll end up with the wrong one when you grab markers again. So always have your swatches nearby, always have your notes nearby, take pictures of the ends of the markers if you need to before the end of the day, before you get started on actually doing whatever drawing you're doing. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and pop this color chart down here with the rest of my massive collection of markers that can't survive in my house anymore, and it's really heavy to carry around and stuff. All right, and I think I can get rid of these hoo-hoos as well and just set them aside. All right, so we're gonna talk about some ways to use alcohol markers. Again, I'm using Copics as my base because that's what I'm most familiar with, but these particular techniques should work fairly well with most different alcohol marker types. Always test on a separate sheet of paper before you get started on your final drawing, because you will be very sad if it doesn't do what you want it to do, and then you have to restart everything. It will make you very, very sad. All right, so we have 3 types of paper in front of me today. Copy paper. This is regular computer paper, like what you might print a coloring page out on. This is generally kind of thin. It's not generally meant for art purposes. So even though it holds up decently, usually not your best option. Sometimes it's what you got, so let's see how it works. Sulfite drawing paper. So this kind of drawing paper is what you will usually find in sketchbooks, things like that. Very basic drawing paper, not really meant for wet or dry media in particular. It's a good workhorse paper. And this right here is Bristol paper. I'm grabbing this one because it's a little bit smoother, and it's going to be more similar to what you have in some higher density sketchbooks, or it's just a little bit smoother. You also have lots of other kinds of paper. You have certain pads that are meant just for marker drawings. Some of them work really well, some of them don't. I hear the Ohuhu brand of marker pads are actually really good and very good at not bleeding through to the back. So I have not gotten to try those personally, but they might be something that you have access to. And there are other types of paper like mineral paper, which is extremely slick and does very interesting things. A little bit less control ability on that kind of paper, but you know, whatever. All papers are going to react differently. So again, take a scratch piece of the type of paper that you are using to do all of your tests and a little bit of swatching to make sure that it looks the way you want it to look before you actually work on your own piece of paper. All right, so I'm gonna grab one of these. Blue. Let's grab a blue-green, why not? All right, so first things first, whenever you are coloring with an alcohol marker, it tends to spread out and even out on its own, but there are ways to make it more successful. So for example, whenever you are doing kind of a back and forth coloring, what you're gonna notice, like this, is that it tends to be a little bit spotty. Sometimes this evens out as it dries, sometimes it doesn't. So one of the first things you want to learn is how to actually just get a flat color when you want it. So the general consensus is that you color in smaller circles and let the color saturate as you're moving along. So that's going to end up with a much even color distribution. The alcohol, as it dries, kind of self-levels, so you get a very even amount of color across your page. Though do be a little bit cautious because sometimes it smells a little bit funny, the same way Sharpies do, because Sharpies also have an alcohol base. All right, so on my copy paper, it worked out pretty well. I'm a little bit surprised, but you know, copy paper, it's useful. Let's grab a different color here because I like using lots of colors. Let's grab a Loquat. I don't think I've used this one much. So on sulfite drawing paper, again, I'm gonna try the zigzagging colors. There might be a reason you need a zigzaggy looking uneven color. Maybe you wanna paint a pineapple, I don't know. And I'm gonna come in and do more little circles. Sulfite drawing paper, I tend to use more with dry media than wet. So I don't entirely know how they interact with the markers. It doesn't seem as even as the copy paper. Don't know why that is, but well, whatever. All right, let's see this red violet over here on the Bristol. Ah, the Bristol is like butter. I love it. Ah! A lot of the times, general rule of thumb is that smoother papers do work better with markers. It is not 100%. So I'm not super surprised, but I do know that Bristol generally tends to be more touted for dry media. So I'm quite excited. The next thing to look at would be bleed. So if I look at the back of my Bristol paper, you can see that I can see slight smudges of where my pink was as I continue to layer markers. That will start eventually leaking through to whatever page is behind. Sulfite, how did y'all do on bleed? A lot more. You can see a lot more spotting on the back there. So do be aware that that is going to happen. And copy paper, not at all surprised. You could definitely see it. Copy paper tends to be pretty thin, so I'm not surprised. All right. So one of the next things that you can do with the Copics and most markers is you can layer. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a slightly lighter color here. And let's use the broad nib. So if I make a mark that goes across and I give that a second to dry, I can go back on top of this same mark and make it darker. So I'm gonna come over here and you can see an actual difference in the color. You can usually do this at least 3 layers. Sometimes you can get 4, depending on the color and the marker and the brand. I usually get 3. Let's see if we can get 4 on some of these though. So as you can see, if the color isn't quite dark enough, sometimes all you need to do to make it look the way you want to look is just go over it again. It's a little like watercolors that way, which I appreciate. I like watercolors a lot. All right, so I think I could probably get at least 1 more value on the sulfite paper and the Bristol, but I'm gonna go ahead and move on because you get the idea. All right, so the next technique I want to show you is a kind of a gradient. This usually works best in a small space, most of the time with alcohol markers, whenever you're trying to do any kind of fancy marker work. You want to try and work in a smaller area just because it does dry really fast. So I'm going to be working in a space about yay big. Can't imagine it'll get much larger. And I'm just going to try and get a gradient between 2 colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of my colors and I'm just going to drag down in a kind of sweeping motion. Go over that once or twice. And while that is still wet, I'm going to grab my other color. Again, I want it handy. I'm going to do a sweeping motion in the opposite direction. And I'm going to go back and forth between these 2 colors once or twice, doing the exact same thing, making sure that the 2 colors overlap. And this should allow me to make a smooth transition between the 2. Like so. Give that a second to dry and we should be able to see it. While it's wet, it does tend to have that little wet look. And it'll lighten up a little bit as it dries. So I'm gonna do that on these 2 so that we can compare in a minute. All right, so I have my 3 done. I did switch colors over here just to kind of show you can do it with more than these colors. So over here on my copy paper, I've got it kind of looking like a ghost print. There's not much going on. It's kind of fading out a little bit. I'm pretty sure that's the paper, not the markers, as it came out just fine over here and over here. And you can see where my colors are overlapping and getting this gradient effect. This one I ended up getting a little bit of a halo right here. That might be because my color change happened, or it might just be because of how I was using the markers. Either way, still a nice smooth gradient, still looks really nice. There is no real marker like streaks that you can see, so overall very successful. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is using the colorless blender. I hope this one has enough ink in it. I use this quite a bit, so we will find out. All right, so there are a couple things to know about your colorless blender. Just like any other colorless thing that you were using, like a Prismacolor colorless blender, it is very easy to get other colors on the end of this marker. So the first thing I want to do is come over to the side and kind of scribble around and see if there's any junk that comes out. Doesn't look like there's any junk today, so we're safe. But there is some pink in this cap from some child, probably, who used my markers, and I should not have trusted them. You know who you are. Anyhow, so first thing we're going to do is put down a layer of colorless blender before we put down any color. This should lighten our color as we are putting it down, and it should also fuzz out the edges of our ink. You can see whenever we put the ink down directly onto the paper, we end up with very sharp edges, and if that is not something that we want, what we want to do first is put down some colorless blender to make sure that our markers kind of fuzz out on the sides, just like if you're using wet on wet technique with watercolor. All right, so I should grab a color here. Let us grab a nice, I keep reaching for the yellows, but they're gonna be hard to see on camera, so I get confused. I'm like, oh no, what do I grab instead? Let's grab a red this time. Garnet, sure. All right, so I'm gonna put down a layer of the colorless blender. Because this paper is so thin, I can really see where I've got this colorless blender down. And then whenever I lay my marker on top, it should fuzz out some. You can kind of see it happening. Again, part of it is going to be just the fact that this is copy paper, and part of it might be the fact that I'm pretty sure my colorless blender's a little bit dead. Oh well, we'll be fine. In fact, let me feel something. Yeah, this is nearly empty. So I need a new colorless blender. Do I actually have colorless blender? No, I don't. All right, we're gonna grab a cool gray. See if this works in its stead. All right, so pretend that this is colorless. It should work the same way. We're going to put down our color or colorless blender. I'm going to put down our other color on top, and we should see it fuzz out. So you can see it over here on this top edge the most right now. It will fuzz out a little bit more, but if you want to encourage it, you can always come back with your first color and put more of this marker on top. And you will see it fuzz away on the edges. Again, normally I would be doing that with a colorless, but again, mine is dead, which I didn't know before starting this video. Do I have another one? I found one. This is slightly different shaped because Copics have several different styles of marker. The one that I prefer is the Copic Sketch. This one is called a Copic 2. They also have Copic Chow, which are right here. And they have one called Wide, which is, as it states, it's fat. So sometimes you get one preference. As I said, I have a preference for the sketch markers, but they all have the same ink in them, so they all work the same way. So right here, we're going to come in and put our colorless down. To make sure I have enough ink on there. I do not know how much this marker has been used. Probably not as much, but I did get this one secondhand from a friend. All right, now I'm gonna grab my marker. And you can pretty much immediately see it starting to fuzz just on that edge a little bit. And again, I can come in and encourage it to fuzz out some more by coloring where I want that fuzz to happen. All right. So again, you can see it work best on our proper drawing papers. Our copy paper starts to get a little bit too thin for this kind of work. That said, that's not the only thing you can do with a colorless blender. A colorless blender is also good for if you want to have a little bit more working time on a surface. So for example, I can do it before I put down things like my gradient to help them blend a little bit smoother, so on and so forth, because of that same fuzzing out effect. Or I can use it to try and lift off some color that's been in a particular area or cause color to move away from a certain area. So let me grab a color. And gotta put this one away. So what should happen, it's been a while since I've done this. I have succeeded at this before. I have a color that I put down. Once that color is closer to dry, I can come in with my colorless, and by putting some colorless blender in that spot, the color of the ink pushes away from the spot where I've put the colorless blender. The longer I color, the bigger that little spot's gonna be. I can also make little lines. And it would probably be worth it to test out if it works better after the markers have dried completely or while they're still wet. I have only ever done it while the markers were still wet. But then again, I'm impatient, so this isn't my favorite technique, but it might be something that you find quite useful for things like stars, etc. All right, so I'm gonna do this again on my other two papers and we can see how they work out. All right, so over here, again, you have our whole little gamut of tests on our different papers. We had how to color properly. We had layering of the markers. We've had blending the markers as well as fuzzing them out with the colorless or removing ink with the colorless. It is a very good idea to make sure that you have tested most of your techniques that you plan on using, because some of them do dry a little different. You can see how much more fuzz has happened on this one since it's dried, and you can see some of the little halo effects that happened on this one when it dried. So always test your markers and things before you're gonna use them on the paper that you're gonna use them on. So hopefully that was very informative for you, and you are now a little bit more confident in different things you might play around or try out with on the alcohol markers. Bye.